Hello, good friends. Welcome back to another special edition of the Bill Press Pod. Every chance he gets, Donald Trump brags about ending 7 wars, which of course is not true. But what is true is that he has started a whole nother war, a war against education. Look, he's cut funding for historic black colleges. He's eliminated research and scientific grants for major universities. He's demanded that professors be fired for teaching gender studies. He supports taking money from public schools and replacing it with vouchers for charter schools. He's appointed a totally unqualified person to be Secretary of Education, and he's announced his intention to totally abolish the Department of Education established by President Jimmy Carter in 1979. Needless to say, abolishing the department will create serious challenges for school kids, parents, teachers, and all of us who value public education. Meeting that challenge and fighting to save public schools is the special mission of our guest today, Randi Weingarten, president of the American Federation of Teachers since 2008 and author of a new book about the critical role of teachers in a democracy with a provocative title, Why Fascists Fear Teachers. President Weingarten, so good to talk to you. Thank you for joining us today on the Bill Press Pod.
Oh my God, Bill, it is so great to talk to you, except that you cannot call me President Weingarten. You have to call me Randy.
I was going to after this. I just want to start with your title. Okay, deal. We've got a deal there. Randy, it seems to me that more than ever, schools and teachers are under attack by the administration, the government. How bad am I wrong? And how bad is it?
No, you're not wrong. And I just want to be I want to be very clear that this week we all have to be mindful, regardless of what Donald Trump says, that there is no place in our country for any political violence. And what happened in Colorado was terrible to children. What happened in Minnesota to children was terrible. But this political violence, whether it's the assassination of Charlie Kirk or whether it was assassination of Melissa Hortman, this is not the way we solve problems in America. We have to abhor all of that. And I just want to be clear that no, no ifs, ands, or buts about that. And then I'll be happy to answer, the questions in terms of what the climate is like and when you have a president that is so basically anti-education, because states have basically run education forever. But what the federal government has done in terms of education is to actually try and level the playing field, to actually try and make sure that all kids really have a shot. And doing what I say in my book about what Lyndon Johnson did, he understood, he taught in the hill country in Texas. He understood what it meant when kids were coming to school without shoes on. He understood that we had to help if we really wanted equality in our country, if we really wanted and said that we wanted all kids to soar, then we had to level the playing field for kids so that poor kids could compete with for and could gain the knowledge and skills with rich kids.
And it seemed to me like this is a question I've got. Okay, we have a Secretary of Education and a president whose goal is to abolish the Department of Education. If we all agree that getting a good education is the essential key to any success in this country, and that an informed citizenry is the essence of democracy, why shouldn't there be a federal Department of Education?
Well, of course, there should be a federal Department of Education. The reason they want to get rid of it is because they don't want to level up the playing field. They don't want to make sure that all kids have opportunity. And they don't want any oversight on any of that. I mean, even take an issue that they care about. So Maybe they don't care about the teaching of slavery. They don't care about well-being of all kids, but take an issue they do care about, something that I'm also that I care a lot about, career and tech ed. They keep saying that career and tech ed is really important. So why are they not working with someone who was a career and tech ed teacher back in the 1990s, who has cared about this issue passionately forever? And instead of working with the AFT and working with teachers and trying to create more and more career and tech ed opportunities in public schools, in high schools, in junior high schools, they're cutting career and tech ed programs. They're moving it from the Department of Education to the Department of Labor that clearly doesn't know what the heck to do about it. So it's the only thing it feels to me they care about in this regard is they want to get those private trade schools up and running again that were closed because they did a terrible job in terms of kids. How many times did we see these private trade schools take money from kids, pretend that they were offering kids all sorts of different programs, then they would close, leaving kids having no diploma and nothing to show for it. And so they're more in love with privatization. They're more in love with the balkanization, the fragmentation of an education system than they are with actually helping all kids learn.
Right. By the way, you referenced your book, and I want to be clear, your very important new book, which I'm right in the middle of, Why Fascists Fear Teachers, a provocative title, Why Fascists Fear Teachers, Public Education and the Future of Democracy is just out. And I'm going to get to you about the theme of this book. But first, just a couple of other questions here about education in general. So, what would be, let's say they succeed, even though the Congress, I guess, would have to get involved, what would be the impact of losing the Department of Education on schools across the country?
So let me actually separate out actually having a Department of Education
Mhm.
and the funding that we
Uh-huh.
have gotten basically starting with the civil rights laws and with Lyndon Johnson in the mid 60s. And first, actually, the GI Bill in after World War II. That's when
Mhm.
we started having a federal role in education to actually subsidize higher education for veterans, for GIs coming back from the war. It's the functions that are important. A department, or remember we used to have before Jimmy Carter created the department in the 80s, it was part of health, education, and welfare. It was part of health services. But if you don't have the money, that's the real problem. And then if you don't have any accountability over the money, then a state could use it any which way it wants. Like, how do you stop a Greg Abbott from basically, or Ryan Walters in Oklahoma, from using it for his called American First strategy, which is essentially let's pretend the 21st century never happened. Let's go back to a time before Brown versus Board of Education, where we can turn away from discrimination, or discrimination not only against people of color, but discrimination against kids with disabilities. So, right now, and we don't get enough money for it, but we have something called the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. About 15% of the funding for kids with disabilities comes from that act and the rules under that act. So, what happens if you don't have a federal Department of Education and you have a kid, you're a parent, you're a kid that's wheelchair bound, and your school system says, I don't care. Your kid is going to be in a class on the third floor. And there's no elevator in the building. What are you as a parent supposed to do if that district says that and says, we just don't have any money to change it? So tough. The law says you can't do that. The law says you have to create the least restrictive environment for that child. The law says you have to accommodate that child. You can't put that child in a non-elevator building on the third floor if that child is wheelchair bound. So you no longer have a Department of Education that is making a school district do it, and you no longer get the money to make sure that you have the accommodations so that kid can be accommodated. That's the purpose of a federal Department of Education. Can it be more efficient? Of course, it can be more efficient. But when you get rid of half of the people and you basically get rid of the at least half of the offices that do these civil rights cases, what a shock. You have thousands and thousands of cases that are backlog. So if
Hmm.
you're that parent, you can't get relief. And most of the funding that we get, the formula funding that I have fought for, others have fought for all these years, that funding goes directly to kids. These issues around civil rights are individual issues for kids and for parents. That's what the Department of Education does.
One other kind of funding. Last week, the Secretary of Education announced that she was ending any grants to colleges that have large minority student populations. These grants called minority serving institution grants.
Yeah, the HBCU grants.
Yeah, basically saying if you have a diverse student population, right, you're somehow not acceptable, and we're no longer going to give you money to support your student population.
Right. And remember, the first time that Trump was president, he used to trot in the heads of HBCUs. He used to try to say, what we're trying to do is make sure that we help you. They've just gone, they've just engaged in erasure. They do not believe that we should be finding ways to create opportunity for everyone. So if you're already, if your parents are rich, if you got a lot of resources already, that's great. You can be fine. But everybody else, not so much. And what they've done in terms of look at the big ugly bill, it's basically a policy bill that says they are transferring wealth from the poor to the rich. So, getting rid of or changing the rules around nutrition, changing the rules around Medicaid, and all in service of giving the rich even a bigger tax cut than he gave them the last time he was president.
First time around. One other item in the news this week, the Surgeon General in the state of Florida says he is eliminating mandates for school vaccines, following the model of the HHS Secretary RFK Jr. Is this how important is this? And do you think others we're going to see other states do the same thing?
Even President Trump wondered whether this was a good idea. Look, I'm not a doctor, I'm a teacher. My sister is a pediatrician. If you are hurting every other student and family around you when you opt not to have these long term studied childhood vaccinations for all kids who are going to elementary school. And you already see it in terms of the measles outbreaks
Hmm.
that are far greater than they've been in years. We almost had a polio outbreak. Think about it this way, even in Gaza, even where nobody can agree on anything else, when there was a potential polio outbreak, everyone got vaccinated. We lived through this. How my cousin had polio. How many of our parents and grandparents had seen the effects of childhood diseases? Why is it that this generation doesn't want to learn from that history? Not all, but this notion, this is where disinformation and misinformation and just is a real disservice. And so when he was on all these shows last weekend or 2 weekends ago, he couldn't answer any questions. This was
Hmm.
just, oh, this is what he thought. Shame on him. How do you do this to people? How do you do this to people who are not doctors? And also, how dare you basically say to all the doctors in the nation, many of whom are juggling so many patients, oh, all these patients now have to go see their doctor and to get questions answered about this rather than relying on the evidence, on the science.
Hmm. He also said they hadn't done any testing right before they made their decision.
Yeah,
So it's
it's just basically a political act. And so if you actually believe in that any of these diseases, if children get it, are contagious, then you're hurting other families and hurting other children.
absolutely. One other item in the news this week in Texas again. If everything gets back to Texas. Governor Abbott wants to see the Ten Commandments in every classroom. Of course, there's some states in the
Several
Southeast have
states,
said the same thing. Yeah.
several states have even courts that are traditionally viewed as very conservative have knocked this out because there's a separation of church and state. And frankly, what's been interesting to me is how many evangelical Christians are starting to say, don't do this. I
Hmm.
believe in a particular sect of Christianity, but you, school teacher, you school, your job is a non religious job. Let me, the parent, the church, focus on religious education. Because if you think about the First Amendment, you think about our country, we always believed from the framers that two things: a real connection to free exercise of religion, which actually means that the state can't impose a religion. So if you really believe in free exercise, then you would never want to impose a Judeo Christian ethos in every single school or every single classroom.
And it certainly is a step back to the past.
It's a step back, but even on issues around church and state, the Constitution has been clear the start of our country. And frankly, it's one of the reasons why we actually have more religion going people in our country than in places that have established a religion. So freedom requires free exercise, which requires the state not to impose their views. So this is the irony here. You got a lot of places where the state is imposing its views that actually create safety problems, gun violence, now vaccine issues. And then you have a lot of places where the state should not be imposing things, their views, like that's clear, like in religious freedom. But this is what the cultural wars are about, and it is a constant focus on this us versus them. And where they think a guy like Abbott, where he thinks the wind is blowing about who should be us and who should be them.
We want to take a quick break here, Randy, and then when we come back, let's talk about your book, Why Fascists Fear Teachers, here on the Bill Press Pod today. Delighted to welcome Randy Weingarten, president of the AFT, as our guest. So take a quick break. We'll be right back. And we're back on today's podcast. Our guest today, Randi Weingarten. She's been president of the AFT, 1.8 million proud members. She's been their president since 2008, one of our outstanding leading labor leaders in this country, a longtime friend of mine, and a woman who's been so effective at her job that Mike Pompeo, former Secretary of State under Donald Trump the first time around, actually called you, Randy, the most dangerous person in the world.
I know it was crazy.
I know you wear that as a badge of honor. And Randy out with a new book called Why Fascists Fear Teachers, by the Public Education and the Future of Democracy. Randy, when I saw the title, I was wondering, what's this about? But as soon as you get into the book, you start out that this going after teachers, particularly, is a hallmark of autocrats throughout history and around the world, right? This
Correct.
isn't not the first time we've seen this.
No. In fact, think about Vladimir Putin. One point or another, he said wars are won by teachers. That is quite the acknowledgement and certainly a veiled threat. Think about the first story I start with is a story about what happened in the Nazi occupation of Norway and where the Nazis attempted to constrain teachers and stop them from teaching, and teachers or stop them from pushing back at him. And teachers started wearing paper clips to show that we're all bound together.
I love that story.
And students start wearing paper clips.
Yeah,
And what you saw is 12 of the 14,000 teachers in Norway wearing paper clips. It made the Nazis, it made them very violent towards the teachers and towards parents and towards kids. And what do? They closed schools and the teachers kept on teaching. I just gave an award to a Ukrainian teacher. We're very close to the Ukrainian Union, a teacher who is teaching in Kherson, one of the occupied areas by Russia, and she has taught whispered Ukrainian, still teaching remote so that Russians wouldn't hear her. This is so what ends up happening in autocracies or autocratic regimes is they immediately or they attempt to thwart the the teaching of critical thinking, the teaching of knowledge. It's not like they don't want to impose their own curriculum, but they attempt to throttle a couple of things that they are really, really that teachers do. One is the teaching of critical thinking, the teaching of how to think, not what to think. And the
hmm
second thing they do is they try to stop having teachers having a safe and welcoming environment for their kids. Because what, and whether you call them fascists or autocrats or tyrants or, whichever word, which is a suppression of freedom and a suppression of free thought and a suppression of all of us being seen equally under the law, is they try to create this us versus them. And what they do, the difference between fascistic behavior and other behavior when they try to create us versus them is that they dehumanize. They don't just divide, they don't just demean, but they dehumanize to such an extent that it enables violence to the then people who have been dehumanized. Think about, for example, what the Nazis did to Jews in Austria, how people, pictures of Jews on their knees washing the sidewalks. That's the kind of dehumanization. So it goes from words to actions. Think about the book banning, the book burning. And so I was very careful because I don't want to label, I intentionally did not label anyone a fascist. I didn't want the story of this book to be, is he or isn't he, like it was
yeah.
for the last few days of the 2024 election. I am a teacher. I wanted to identify fascistic behavior. I wanted teachers, I wanted parents, I wanted people who read the book to see what fascistic behavior is. But equally important in this book, I wanted to show the antidote, which are teachers. And I wanted to talk about teachers, whether it be Lyndon Johnson or Karen Lewis or Abby Clemens or Ryan Richmond or Barbara Johns. I talk about teachers and what they do as teachers and how they try to not only assure that we have a democracy and the free thought that's required for that, but how they nurture young people and do whatever they can, regardless of the situation, to help young people have the skills and knowledge they need to thrive. And they are my heroes. And part of this was not just to see what fascistic behavior is and why fascists fear teachers, but to be a love story to the teachers who every single day, regardless of what is thrown at them, are trying to help our students succeed.
And you make the point that the reason these autocrats fear critical thinking is because it's a threat to their autocracy, to their
Correct.
rule.
The first thing Orban did was to get rid of Central University, the university he went to in Hungary. Look at what they're doing about colleges. Look at how they disdain and demean colleges. Now, I'm not saying that either that colleges shouldn't change. There's a bunch of things that colleges should be doing that are better, including they shouldn't be so expensive. We have to find ways that there's an array of curricula that's good for kids, that kids feel, that they can thrive. There were in the aftermath of October 7th and what happened in Israel, and both the Hamas attack of Israel and the Israel war against Gaza, there were lots of protests in the United States, and a lot of Jews in those protests felt unsafe, and that was a problem. And there is a lot of anti-Semitism in the country. So all I'm saying is there's a lot of things that colleges should be doing better. There's a lot of things that K-12 should be doing better. But the demeaning of teachers, the not giving people the benefit of the doubt, the taking away of resources, the erasing of history, the book banning, the culture wars, the injection of politics at every moment. This is not how you help kids advance. And so I wanted to make sure people understood the spectrum of this kind of behavior, since in America, we don't really teach about fascism. We don't really teach about authoritarianism. And if you look at and think about what our founders said, every Madison, Jefferson, Washington, Franklin, they all believed in education
Right,
as
right.
the way you
Hmm.
stop tyranny. They understood that. They had lived through tyranny. They rebelled against tyranny. They didn't want a king. So, my plea is just like my grandparents and my parents had, and I had relatives that suffered through polio and understood that the vaccines helped avert a death sentence. That kind of pain. The founders and the framers understood that education, that having education, having critical thinking was the way we stop tyrants.
An informed citizenry, right? They call it the key to
Correct.
democracy. Randy, so by the way, Why Fascists Fear Teachers again, the book is just out, and we will have a link in the episode notes to today's
Right.
podcast where you can get your own copy of Why Fascists Fear Teachers. Before I let you go, Randy, you mentioned earlier it's such an important issue. I just want to touch on it briefly with you. I just checked before we talked. As of September 10, there have been 47 school shootings in the United States this year alone, 24 of them on college campuses, 23 of them K through 12. Talk to us a little bit about the impact on students, on teachers for having to go through these drills, right, in case there's a shooter or gunman who arrives on the campus. What impact that's having on schools, and are we doing enough to keep our schools safe?
No, we are not doing enough to keep our schools safe. And think about how few of these things how few happened when there was an assault weapon ban. And think about how few of these
Mm.
instances happen, even with the terrible environment that social media and the algorithms and the hate that's spewed on social media. And with all that, you look around the world how few of these events, how few of this carnage happens around the world, and then look at what happens in the United States. Don't tell me that the availability of guns, particularly these weapons of war, don't have any impact here. And so it's terrible. It is both the carnage that happens with, look what happened to Charlie Kirk.
Hmm.
An assassination, 500 assassinating him. Look at what happened in that school in Colorado that day. Look at what happened in that school in praying, the church in
Yeah.
Minnesota, kids praying, being prey as they're praying. This is not about hunters. This is not about gun owners who understand how to be gun owners. This is not about taking people's freedoms away. This is about, why does anybody have to have a weapon of war on the streets of America other than law enforcement? Why? What is the purpose of it? What is the need for it? And what's happened is there's tremendous carnage. And so there's a bunch of things that one can do that have been done already: safe storage laws, red flag laws, other types of things. But this administration wants to take away all of that as well. And in fact, the current Secretary of Education took away, stripped away the millions of dollars that were created as grants to try to deter gun violence in schools that happened after Uvalde. Bipartisan grants. She took them away.
You just wonder why, right? What's going on? What are they thinking?
It's an anti-education. It is, that's why it's the sphere of knowledge. It's a sphere of agency. It's a sphere of empowerment. It's a sphere of the future. It's a sense that, okay, it's fine if, you are rich and, your kids have the advantages of the world, but what about everybody else? That is what the civil rights laws were about: creating equal opportunity, diversity, inclusion. It's about all of us having a future, not just some of us. It's about not just the us, but it's the us and the them and all of us together having a future.
Randi Weingarten, the kids of America, the teachers of America, and all of us are lucky to have you where you are as president of the AFT.
Thank you, Bill.
So thank you so much for all your great work. And thank you. Congratulations on the book, Why Fascists Fear Teachers. And thanks for joining us today on the Bill Press Pod. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you, Bill. Really appreciate it.
And that's a wrap for today's podcast. A big thank you to Randi Weingarten, who does a great job at the AFT, and her new book is really worth getting and reading. There's a link, as I mentioned, a link in the episode notes to today's podcast to get your copy of Randi's new book, Why Fascists Fear Teachers. And with that, another busy week ahead. We'll be keeping an eye on progress or lack of toward a government shutdown, continuing fallout from the assassination of Charlie Kirk, the latest on the Epstein files, and how about that big mayor's race in New York? We'll be following all the political news from Washington and around the country with our Reporters Roundtable coming up this Friday. So again, have a great week, everybody, and come back and see us on Friday for our Reporters Roundtable, the next edition of the Bill Press Pod.